What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Long Box Sessions. I'm your host, Alex Dandino.
And I'm Josh Griffey.
Hopefully you're catching us on one of your socials. That's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Or if you're on YouTube, you can see our faces at Nerd Alchemist, plural, with an S. And then, of course, whatever podcast platform you use, be it Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify. Stop the pod right now. Rate, review, subscribe. Tell your friends. Thank you so much for all of you who've done it. We've seen a couple pop up. We really appreciate it. We love you. Keep doing it.
That's right.
And then, of course, you can check out our other show, the Film Alchemist podcast, where this month the pod takes the case. We're watching detective movies, and Griffey's going to try to convince me that I should think The Golden Child is good. So we'll see what happens.
Not only
a hell of a month.
All right, fine. We'll start a little Gregory pecking right now. Not only, Your Honor, is The Golden Child a great movie, it's the best Eddie Murphy detecting movie.
Okay.
See my exhibits 1 through 8,000 on the
I'm not the only person who thinks that Beverly Hills Cop would be that, so I'm interested to hear your arguments.
It's gonna be
That's
rock
neither
solid.
here nor there, guys.
It's gonna be rock solid.
We hope you are. We hope you're having a good week, Griff. I'm not really sure where to start here, but I have to ask you: Have you read any comic books recently?
I've been so busy with work. I haven't really been reading comics, but I did want to run by you. Have you watched My Hero Academia at all?
No.
All right. And I know you're not an anime guy, but this one will be right up your alley because essentially,
okay,
My Hero Academia is a world of quirks, right? That's what they call superpowers. And it's a world where the vast majority of people have at least some quirk, right? So the barista at Starbucks might have like something, right? Not insanely overpowered. Some are really strong, some are not. The strongest of the people can apply to this school and get training and try to become professional heroes, right? They have rankings and this and that. There are bad guys, villains, all this stuff, right? And what I love about this, and this is what I wanted to ask you about, right? We live in a world now where it's so cool to deconstruct superheroes, right? Like taking apart the things, looking at them as broken, blah, blah, blah. Famously, like The Incredibles does that. And that's actually what made me think of it. There's a beautiful moment, right? What I love about My Hero Academia is it's kind of swimming upstream in the world of superheroes, right? Which is, it's so relentlessly optimistic and positive, right? So essentially the story would be this kid who had no quirk, right? Desperately wants to be a hero but had no special powers. He meets Superman and impresses him by leaping into action with no powers. And Superman says, "Hey, I'm dying. I'll give you my powers," right? So now the kid has the powers. And he's so insanely good-natured and heroic. And there's a line in the show, right, where he's like, of course superheroes have to wear capes. That's what they use to wrap the victims in, right? Like, it's like a blanket. And I was like, oh, my fucking God. Because I know it's like the classic, don't wear a cape, you'll get caught. You know, that old fucking joke, right? But this is like, of course you wear a cape because then you wrap up a child in it. And it becomes this totem, right? That is now in the world like, look, this is the blanket All Might wrap me up in. And it becomes this fucking goodwill spreading tool on its own. And the show is so relentlessly optimistic that I wanted to ask you, do you think we're at the point where you can still do that kind of story regularly? Or are we at the point now where you always have to be bending the kind of superhero myth more down to the real and the broken?
Oh, hell no, man. I mean, I think that we're in a perfect time and a perfect place for the optimistic superhero story.
I was shocked because it's so saccharine at times, but it always fucking gets me. It works on me every episode.
No, man, that's what great comics, I think. Like, that's the thing that we've talked about, too. Like, I think the deconstruction genre itself, and I would call it a genre because, like, there are so many books that do this. But, like, the deconstruction of superheroes themselves can be interesting and can be sort of uplifting at times. Because a lot of the times, like, great deconstruction stories, to me, do one of two things. They either dismantle the facade of a superhero completely, or in the case of like kind of like I would say in the case like Mr. Miracle is a great example. Mr. Miracle to me is a really upbeat, happy book because it is about the good that life can bring, even in the like hardest of times per se.
Yeah.
For a superhero, the good that life can be. So no, man. I mean, I think positive stories like that and happiness in the world of superheroism is so important. More so than most.
Yeah, and it's weird too because I think what you said there is interesting, which is we want to destroy the facade of every hero, right? And I think what it is, a lot of writers come in and they're like, "Oh, I'll show you how fucking clever I am. I've thought about this more than you." And what I'm left with is You're like, well, now I don't look at Iron Man or Batman or a bunch of books I liked as a kid. I don't see them as heroes anymore, right? Like I've aged myself and I've read so many books where it's like, Tony Stark, you're a fucking weapons monger and like you've done all these bad things. Tony Stark always creates the bad guys. I'm like, you've spread so much fucking misery in this world, right? And it's even like Superman Year One we talked about was a little more of like a maybe fuck humans, right? But then he kind of overcame that, right? But there is this point where I wonder, and it's one of the weird things because Superman has always taken that shot, right? Is a superhero interesting if all he does is good and has all the powers? In My Hero Academia found the way. It almost becomes the more interesting writer's challenge, which is, all right, Superman always makes the best choice available to him. He has immense powers that he doesn't abuse. And yeah, he's really hard to fucking kill with physical beatings, right? Show me. And the challenge becomes, all right, I'm going to work within those confines instead of the, oh, all I really want to do is kill people, but I'm still good, right? Because I grew up on a farming community. Like, what if he lands like, 3 miles down the road at the family that like watches too much pro wrestling. Dad has a few too many beers every night, maybe smacks Clark around a little bit, and then next thing you know, dark side. Right?
Well, I mean, they've addressed that in the comics too. Like, Superman Red Sun's one of our favorite Elseworld stories.
Right.
They just released the.
But that's
movie.
What I mean. That is all exists because we have to explain away why this guy's so good. And you're like, maybe there's just good people out. I think it's one of those things we forget a lot today, right? Because every TV show's anti-heroes, right? We glorify the bad. We like to see people's flaws and this and that. And what My Hero has reminded me, like I watch it with my kids and they get amped, right? And they just had a new movie that came out in theaters this weekend, was why I was like thinking about it.
Right.
Again. But I was like, it's nice to watch a show with my kids and be like, yeah, that's why Midoriya always is like, this might fucking break my arm or kill me, but like, I got to do what's right. Because if I don't, this person who sees me fail will no longer believe that there are heroes out there, that there are people willing to do good. And it's kind of this greater look at us as a species trying to, just be better versions of ourselves. And I think it's crazy how often we forget that story is really cathartic to us.
I mean, I think it's the thing that I think people have forgotten in the last, really since, Dark Knight Returns came out. That's
a great fucking book. I love those books.
No, it's a great book.
Right.
But because it's such a shock to the system, everybody in that book is terrible. Even Superman, who supposedly is doing the right thing, is literally only doing the right thing if Ronald Reagan says so. Right. He's a tool of the government.
You could argue he's not doing the right thing at all.
Yeah, everybody sucks in The Dark Knight Returns. Yeah. That's the whole point of the book, though. And I feel like that sent such a shockwave through the system of comics that it's taken us this long to get back to a place where you can read books that maybe aren't I don't want to say cynical, because cynical is become the catch-all term for a lot of deconstructionist stuff.
Right.
And there's a lot of good-natured deconstructionist books. Again, I know I harp on this, but Tom King does it so much better than a lot of people because he doesn't focus on just solely negative things that happen to characters in books. But he really
does more reimaginings than deconstructions, really.
Right. And again, he has the advantage of taking characters. He's done a very smart thing a lot of the time, which is take characters and gone and pitched these stories about the books that no one remembers. Look, I love Vision, okay? But let's be honest, until he showed up as Paul Bettany in Age of Ultron, did anybody besides like you, me, and the collectively 30 people who thought he was awesome beforehand know that he was a character for a long time? No.
Yeah,
So like
I mean,
that's
but this
like
is what what's the last thing you read that really focused on just that bright, shining light? Like just a guy out there doing good just because.
I mean, I can't even tell you, to be honest with you, man. I mean, like,
yeah, that's what I mean.
The best,
because everything I read is like they are good, but there's always that but.
Right. Well, the best example I have, I think, is probably. It's weird. I just actually finished the first issue of this Invisible Woman book that Mark Waid wrote with Adam Hughes, and it's like kind of like it's a little bit of a life story thing, like Spider-Man, but it's basically starts with her. She's like undercover in the Soviet Union, and then she takes off a wig and she's like, "Sorry, I got a day job," and she's in like the old school Fantastic Four costume. And you're like, "This is weird," but I'm uniquely interested in a woman who like all she has to do is be invisible and do whatever she can walk through anything.
Right.
She can do whatever she wants, and she chooses to put herself in harm's way, not with her family but with strangers, for the good of what? Like that I think is that's probably the closest I've gotten to like saccharine goodness, I would say.
Is that goodness, or is there some kind of like Clive Barkery, I want to be abused and hurt? It's got to be dangerous.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. This is the closest I've gotten to sweet saccharine goodness. Like,
yeah,
I can't remember. I mean, honestly, probably like I don't know. Stan
Shirtless
Lee,
bear fighter. Where he's just like, there's bears and they need fighting. You're like, all right, I guess. But even then, he's not. Great all the way through. I don't know. Yeah, it's so weird. I was like, maybe Concrete is like the last thing that I like really picked up. And granted, that book's old, but when I read it like a couple years ago, like it is just a guy like trying to be okay, right? You see it a lot in indie stuff, but even the indie stuff I've been reading lately is like, oh god, it's so hard and bad, but like I find love by the end of the summer, and it's great. Yeah, I don't know. It really struck me though, because you just watch Superman inspire this kid, and then this kid is so trying his best, even though it cost him dearly to use the power because it's so immense, that you see him just really break and inspire his teammates. And the way the show walks you through like how impressed they are with his heroic actions, and the way it ripples through a classroom full of other maybe as powerful superheroes, it really struck me as, man, like, especially today, right? Everything always seems like I remember I woke up Saturday morning and I just turned on Real Time with Bill Maher. Even though I hate it every week, it's just become it's like just one of those things I've done for like years. Like I wake up Saturday, and it's the thing I always find myself, I'm like, I want to watch Bill Maher's show, but with someone way better than Bill Maher, right? And like without like the Republican trolls he always brings. Like I want to watch that kind of a show, just with different voices that are more interesting. But it's just become habit. And like I was talking to Amy, I was like, fuck, man. When that show ends, I just expect to like open my door and see the whole fucking world on fire. And I feel that way a lot. You open Twitter, you look at everything, you're just like, well, everything's horrible. People are trash.
Yeah.
I run a YouTube channel, so we just get like accosted on the internet all week by fucking people. And you're just like, this all sucks. And then I turn on that show, and I can watch the My Hero Academia movie with my son. And there's this really cool, like, just watching the younger... There's a thing where a villain actually, he's like, I had to help these villains because you won't be around forever. And, like, he does this horrible thing, right? Because he's afraid of losing Superman.
Right.
And by the end, he sees how much these inspired young people have, like, pulled together to be heroic. And there's this great shot of, like, the Superman, right? Like, up there. And it's his old sidekick who did it, too, right? But then he, like, blinks his eyes, and it's the young kid in the same pose. And watching that with my kid, I was like, holy fuck, man. Like, yeah, dude. Like, they'll be fine, right? Our parents felt this way, and we just, like, we're fine, right? Like, they'll keep fighting. There's still hope. And it really struck me. I was like, fuck, man. I don't experience that story ever. Like, now that Westworld's out, it's about to be, fuckbots and Jesse Pinkman running buck wild on the earth again. I'm going to sink back into misery, right? It's nice to take a moment and just watch these fucking kids just be heroic. Just truly, truly heroic and inspiring. But yeah, it kind of struck me. I was like, wow, because that's what the whole genre was built on for so long. And I think that's why we love it as kids, until you're old enough to start reading like Preacher and Punisher.
Right.
And, like,
well,
it's nice to come
what's
back to
happened
it.
is, I think that's the difference of like changing with you as an adult is like the reason you read comics now is different than the reason you read comics when you were a kid. I mean, I read comics when I was a kid because, obviously there was the escapist thing. I don't think that ever really goes away, but I thought a lot about, it's inspiring. It's inspiring to see people do things that in your child mind you perceive as do things for the right reasons, Obviously, when you're a lot older, you can read subtext. People are like, oh, this person is literally doing it for themselves, and only for the group of people around them. Great.
Bruce Wayne is actually just abusing mentally handicapped people for his own fun and games. Wow, this is brutal. But yeah, I mean, I'm at the age now I've come back where you're like, it's so funny. Our friend Sam, he was like, because his dad he got him into all this, right? D&D and fantasy and like board, all of it, right? Comes from his dad. And I was like, oh, your dad must love this and Game of Thrones and blah. He's like, no. He's like, my dad doesn't like that none of them are heroic. His dad also hit the point where like now he's old enough. He's like, he wants to see people fighting the fight because that's what is the right thing to do.
You know what? My dad does
and I'm there, man. I feel like I'm starting to get there.
My dad does not want to go. Like, my dad's big thing about going to, like, movies, particularly. Like, my dad refuses to watch depressing movies. Like, I've told him, like, every year when we come around to, like, Oscar movies, he asks me, like this year, he was like, how was Joker? I'm like, it was good. And he goes, would I like it? And I'm like, no.
No.
It's like, why not? And I said, because it's depressing. Yeah. Like, think about the worst possible thing that could happen to someone that turns them into the worst possible version of themselves. That is Joker. He's like, oh. Yeah, I don't want to watch that. I'm like, cool. Just watch like Endgame or something. I don't know.
Your dad's just watching like old MGM musicals all day or what?
No, my dad watches mainly World War II documentaries, so that's
super uplifting. That totally makes sense.
Well, that's true heroism, man. That's where it lives. That's heroics. That's if you want to talk about like real heroes, that's like people who beat the draft to the punch. That's heroic, Like, just going because it was the right thing to do?
I'm not wading into this one.
Well, I mean, that's the perception, though. So
hey,
anyways.
Man. Maybe, baby. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm just a guy.
Hey.
I don't know either. I read something interesting this week.
Okay, go for it, yeah.
I'm not sure if you saw this. I read that they were going to do a graphic novel version of Parasite with Bong Joon-ho's storyboards.
What I had read is that it's not actually like a graphic novel, as it were, but they're essentially just taking his storyboards and packaging them the same way we would buy a graphic novel. I don't believe they're adapting them to the medium as much as just, hey, it's also a picture book with some words.
Right.
Like they might.
Well, that's kind of what
script.
I figured was happening.
Yeah.
But as soon as this is like the issue is when people start tossing around the word graphic novel. Yeah. People don't seem to understand what that actually means. But because I assumed what it was storyboards, and then they have like little blurbs of like, this scene was hard to film because of X, Y, and Z. Which is like I have those books. Like they have that for the Dark Knight. But
you actually, as a joke, bought me that for the Green Lantern movie with Ryan Reynolds.
I did.
Constructing the Green Lantern.
It was $5. It was $5 at Barnes and Noble, Barnes and Noble.
I still own it to this day. I didn't throw it immediately in the trash.
I knew you wouldn't. It was a really important purchase for you.
I love having bits of things around my house that remind me that even people who reach the top just fail spectacularly sometimes.
Sometimes it happens, man.
Yeah,
but I was thinking about this, and I was looking at. Because, like, obviously it's probably what I think it is, which is storyboards and little blurbs. But do you think if someone was actually – because we talk a lot about people sometimes, like, we've read movie scripts from people before and, like, other things like that. And they're like, I'm not sure if it works as a movie, but maybe I'll just turn it into a comic book. I'm like, that is it's so insulting. Like, that's one of the worst things I've ever heard people say, like, it's like up there with like calling a woman the C word. Like I hate listening to that kind of shit.
Is it the same? I don't know. No,
it's not.
I used to do a lot of screenplay analysis. You did that too for work at times. But it was one of those things I kept running into is people are like, oh, you're also like a comic book guy. I have this script and it would make a good comic. And I'd always be like, well, what kind of comic do you see it as? And they would just tell me, it's like Aliens, but my version of it. And now I want it to be I'm like, that's not answering my question, right? And I think what annoys me about it is I think what happens is people don't take the time to understand what makes really good comics and graphic novels soar, right? They're just
Right.
I mean, it is the same thing, right? Waiting for Godot, if that had just come out as a comic book, probably not the groundbreaking work it became, right? Because medium really matters. Now, could you take that and then once you have it successful and you have a fan base for it, my question is when you're transporting genre, right? So I used to know screenwriters, and they were trying to write for the screen, and that requires a specific way of writing, right? And I always be like, why did you think that should be on the screen? Because you wanted a big fucking movie check? Or because there's something that makes film the best medium, right? Like everything.
Right.
When a writer sits down, I do this, you do this, right? Granted, we're not even successful. You're always like, what's the best way to present this idea?
Right.
And hopefully that's how you come to that, not just, oh, we'll fucking shoehorn it in later.
Right.
Because it just changes the writing dramatically.
I mean, I can tell you when I sit down to write, like my baseline is writing a comic book. Like it definitely used to be screenplay, and I've just grown out of that simply because I wasn't very good at writing screenplays. But I also found that I take a lot more pleasure in writing comic books. So my base level understanding of when I want to make a story is that I want to turn it into a comic book, which again is not everybody else's thing, but it's important to know, like you said, medium matters, like what you're writing for. So I was thinking about this in relation to Parasite because I'm like, okay, obviously that's not how this is coming out, but would Parasite make a good comic book? Could you make it a good comic book?
Absolutely.
It would be pretty fucking badass, right?
But there are so many things that would make a good comic book if you utilize the elements of the medium that make comic books fun to read. Because the movie plays is almost a heist movie at times. Like there's a lot of different genres, right? But I read books all the time that kind of dabble back and forth in this. In the constantly layering what this character is presenting and then what they're showing to the world, that gives you so many fun opportunities to play with your panel layouts and this and that. Yeah, I think Parasite is a really strong story. The question becomes, what is the comic book version of that best utilizes what that story has to offer?
Right. I was thinking about this. Like, I feel like a great Parasite comic book utilizes the visual of underneath the house a lot more. Like, I don't know how to properly describe it, but like I do see a lot more of what happens underneath the house coming into play, and not necessarily like we go over like more of his backstory and so on and so forth. We actually just see that a lot of the time. Like visually, I feel like you throw little artifacts in the background and have little things like that. Like the lights is another great example, a great visual bit that you could panel out really well and very interestingly. But I also feel like artifacts from that guy running around, like those kinds of things, like so on and so forth, that actually could provide you with a lot of great visuals that enrich that story and make it a better comic book rather than a movie itself. I don't know.
The visuals of comic books are different, right? Like some of the greatest visuals in cinema history are just how do you present the human emotion, right? Comic books, I think, will never have... There's no panel that can be drawn that will match a slow push-in on Daniel Day-Lewis's face, right? With a swelling score underneath. It's just going to be really hard to match that. But comics can do it in a really different way. So that becomes the... Why this version, right? And that's what I think everyone when you're writing for the screen, right? I know for a fact I've written that scene where you're like, this is the fucking moment, right? We're just going to hold on this fucking face and dominate. All right, well, what emotion is that you're trying to sell, right? What is that in human experience terms, right? How then do you get there over 1 to 3 or 4 pages of a comic? You know, it's a completely different set of tools, right? Everyone's like, it's pictures and words, and it's the same. You're like, no, it's fucking not. And also,
No.
movies have scores that can help them lift those, can elevate those images so much, right? Like, imagine a John Williams score for Star Wars. You don't have that in comics either.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't.
Right.
That's
I mean,
the
I
question
think about,
is you find the emotion, and how do you, you know, so in Parasite, when they have the very precise timing of when they cut around to this and that, like, how do you best utilize the gutters in a Parasite graphic novel? You know what I mean? That's the kind of stuff you have to figure out.
Right. That's the kind of stuff you have to think about. Like that scene where they're on their way home and she's cooking the Ramdan, like that can be paneled very well, but it has to be paneled very specifically to properly time everything out. Like when you're cutting a movie, time's moving in a very linear fashion. So obviously you're going to be able to cut a movie together and cut that stuff to build the tension. When you're doing a comic book, you don't know what pace anyone's actually reading it at. So you have to absolutely kind of cut. Your cuts have to be very specific and your visuals have to be very specific to actually build the tension through. You have to cut back and forth a lot more rather than the way they did it in the movie. It's just a different language altogether, and I'm not sure people understand that a lot of the time. So it's interesting you bring up, because I also thought There Will Be Blood would be a really interesting comic book, but in a way that is completely different than I think Paul Thomas Anderson would make the movie. I feel like if I was going to look at something like There Will Be Blood as a comic book, it feels almost like a Shaboot almost, you know?
Yeah.
Like if I think about the way Alone is, it's so universal and yet so drawn out and all that stuff. Like that's exactly the way that I feel like a comic book for There Will Be Blood would have to work as well, to still have the same kind of tension almost.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a mystery in that regard. I mean, landfills are filled to the brim with comic books and TV shows that have then become really bad comics because they're just like, well, we've got Mulder and Scully, we've got Pinhead, we've got RoboCop, we've got aliens, you know. That's all we need. Just throw them doing some things in. And it loses the magic of the properties we like that these books are based on. But if you really sit down and you figure out, that's the thing, every movie, every story, every song, you can break it down to a core emotional element, right? This is what it is supposed to do to us when we watch it, right? It is very much like crafting a spell, right? Like we want it to have this effect, right? Like you don't write, Hey Jude, so that moms aren't crying in their expensive fucking seats. You know what I mean? Like that has a very fucking pointed, weaponized purpose. So how do you do that same thing, but with the different tools? And yeah, I mean, if you do that, if you just want to sell it based on what it was before, hey man, it's still hopefully a comic book publisher and distributor and manufacturer making some ducats, man. Nothing wrong with that. But to truly have it sing, you have to. They're so. I think people, they just assume they're both. Especially when you look at storyboards, I think sometimes it can be deceiving. Of, oh well, you got this and this and this and this. All right, fine. Right. And I do think also it works the other way better. It's easier to see a comic and be like, that is a perfect storyboard for a movie, because I think film is more expansive, right?
Sure. I mean,
because you can play the moments out more specifically. You can add, the score to replace some of the, internal dialogue, this and that. But I think, the storyboard or screenplay, God forbid, to comic book is much, much harder.
Right. Well, like film has the ability to fill in the gutters in the way that comic books don't. Like what film's not asking you to do is the same thing that comics ask you to do. Comics ask you to build the movement in your mind. You do that yourself. Movies aren't asking you to do that. Movies are asking you to sit back and watch the filmmaker do his work like that. There is like this sort of reciprocity, sort of quid pro quo between comic book reader and comic book writer and artist, which is like, we're going to do this part of the work, but you also should be working on actually moving the story yourself forward. Like there's probably, I think my favorite example of translation like this is The Fountain, actually. The Fountain movie came out, I think in 2006 or 7. And I think the comic book version of it came out 10 years later, maybe 5 or 10 years later, somewhere in there, because Darren Aronofsky had been shut down like so often by this project. This was like his like big passion project, but he had made this comic book, and so this visual story that he had was there. The comic book, in my opinion, is very different than the movie itself. It has a far more ethereal vibe to it and a far more ethereal theme. They spend a lot more time in the space station stuff. Like that, to me, is what is so awesome about comic books and does such a good job, is that comics can take you to a place because you don't have to sit there and like there is no budget in comics. That's like the beauty of comic books in general, is like you don't have to think about the $70 million you have to make a movie and where you can stretch $1. When you say like, I need a tree bubble, you can just make that. But like you can draw that on the page. That works very well. When you have to think about how much it's going to cost, art department, visual effects, so on and so forth, it's a very different conversation. So the ability a writer has to expand the world on a page is very different than the ability the writer has to expand the world in television or film. But the limitation of comic books is you have to know the language you're speaking. You can't speak movie language in comic books because, again, there's piping there. You have to let the reader do the work in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you could make the argument that films and comics are broken down to the great image, right? It is just a series of great and important images, right? You could also make the argument that film is more consistently full of great images because, like you said, it costs way more money to put anything on film than in a panel, right? And, if a movie's 2 hours long, every 10-second shot has a value that is greater than a lot of comic book panels, right? But what I think that you're hitting on, too, is, the expansiveness of comics is obvious, right? That I can do something like Descender very easily as a comic. Would be wildly hard to film that and make it any fucking good for a film, right? Like, I'm sure they will someday, but, that's big stuff, man. To animate the things that eat planets and all the spaceship battles and the entire robot race and the giant fucking fat pig monster race, like, that cost a lot of money. What I think, those differences are more easy to see. What I think becomes more interesting is, and I think this got back to what we were talking about in our Rob Liefeld show, which is he doesn't seem to like the idea of comics that are just kind of small character drama, where there isn't a lot of big punchies and explosions, you know what I mean, to like entertain his mind. Right? And maybe there's some case to that. But when you're talking about something like Parasite, right, that's where you have to really rely on those smaller moments. You know what I mean? That's where you've really got... When he is sitting there holding his daughter, who's bleeding to death, looking at the guy saying, drop her and come save my son, and recoiling as he smells the smell of poor people. That has to be drawn on a page a lot fucking differently. And so to get that exact same effect on the page, I think it can be done, but that's the battle. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that's the constant struggle of like, what's going to have a better impact? And I really don't think there's an answer because it all is just in the eyes of the reader or the watcher. Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, imagine if they did a movie version of Alone by Chabot. Like, you and I both love that book. That is a 400-page weighty tome that you can read in like, I don't know, 45 minutes if you take it slow. It's not a slow read. It's just a lot of pictures. And it's meant to be a lot of pictures. It's meant to be paced a certain way. So, like, imagine them making a film version of that. Like, that to me, that movie's like 10 minutes long. Like, that's a short film. Like, you don't make that a feature-length film.
I mean,
it's a short film to me.
I mean, yeah, you would have to expand a lot. But that's what I mean.
Right.
That book alone is one of the more cinematically paced books I've ever read. Right?
Absolutely.
But this is just the reality. It's weird because the trend for the last decade plus is people writing comic books and graphic novels specifically as IP to be snapped up for the screen, right? And you've seen a shift in the way comics have been written to, play with that.
Right.
If we start getting, what I would say is that this has already begun and is going to keep happening more and more and more, right? That screenplay's gone awry or lost in a shelf somewhere. Someone can put that book out themselves for a couple grand, right? And it might not be the best thing, but anything is better than a screenplay that no one's reading. Take my word on it. And what is interesting, though, is the thought of big, popular, successful movies being translated backwards. That would become a new standard to me.
Right. And I think that's the part that interests me is, could you do that, and would it be as successful? Obviously, you're not going to make like blockbuster money, but I mean, would it be as successful as like, the top-rated Marvel book or the top-rated DC story?
Yeah.
Like,
well, take something, right? The remake of The Blob, right, is so wildly popular because of the visceral action and practical effects. But could you also write a really fun book that spends more time examining the underside of why this monster is so fucking scary, that also has some amazing splash pages when you turn, you're like, oh, fuck. Yeah, for sure. Right. But that's what I mean, right? I would even, there are different kinds of those journeys.
Right. I mean, I would say the tougher thing would be to re-examine something. Like, I just watched, I hadn't seen it in a long time, but I just watched American Splendor on HBO. And American Splendor is a great movie, and it's a great example of like the melding of the two things, because there's so much blur between what Harvey's writing and what Harvey's actually doing in the movie, because Harvey Pekar literally wrote this comic book about his life. Like, there's literally no embellishment most of the time in these books. Yeah. Like, he just wrote, this happened, which is cool. Sure. So could you take something like that? Like, I'm not saying it would be a nationwide bestseller, but if you reverse engineered a movie like I mean, really, like, think about, like, what about Pulp Fiction? Like, something that was segmented like that, something that is chaptered in a way that could work in comic books like that. I feel like you could actually make even though it'd be a lot of dialogue bubbles on the page,
right?
You could actually.
And he has so much to do with the music and kind of this pop culture amalgamation. I think Tarantino would lose out a lot, right? Yeah, I think you have to look for books that have a bigger thematic through line, right? Something my mom was just talking about. What's Eating Gilbert Grape, right? Right. That would be an interesting one to see how that translates down. But again, if it has the really strong emotional theme, you can figure out how to get that job done on the page, right?
Sure.
It's just a different journey.
It's just a different language. And it's interesting. It's interesting to hear people talk about. It's interesting to hear people talk about like what a graphic novel is and how a graphic novel will work. But I loved Parasite. I would absolutely read a graphic novel version of that movie though.
Right.
So,
but you wouldn't read the fucking storyboards with the script spliced in.
I mean, I've already done that. That's easy.
Well, if you're doing that, why not just watch the fucking movie, right? If you're going to make the comic book, add the extra art that adds to my experience of Parasite.
The comic book's a reason for me to. The comic book's a new version of a story that I enjoy, so I'm gonna read that anywames. If I'm just looking at story, like,
speaking of parasites, Jesus Christ, they're gonna have a comic, a TV show. The fucking
with Mark
leeches
Ruffalo
are out, my friend.
Everybody wants a piece of Korean cinema now.
Hey,
bring it on!
Wants that dollar,
please?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I personally would love to read a There Will Be Blood comic book. Actually, now that I think about it, I don't know why. I'd be interested in seeing that. What about you guys? Is there any movies that you think would be interesting comic books? Can we reverse engineer, or is it the other way around only? Who knows? I actually just watched Zoe Kravitz in the TV version of High Fidelity, which is pretty weird, if I do say so myself. If you haven't seen it, give it a shot. Guys, we hope you're having a great week. As always, catch us on all your social medias. Catch us on YouTube. Hopefully, if you're watching us on YouTube right now, you're subscribing to the channel, Nerd Alchemists. We're on Film Alchemist, where this month, the pod takes the case. We're watching detective movies. Obviously, Griffey is going to try to convince me that The Golden Child is the best Eddie Murphy movie.
Griffey will convince you that
We'll see
Golden
how.
Child is the best Eddie Murphy movie.
We'll see how it goes. Guys, thank you so much for listening. From the Long Box Sessions, I'm Alex Dandino.
And I'm Josh Griffey.